Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Communion and Shalom. We're glad to have you joining us today. This episode, TJ and I are coming together to talk about where we see unity in the side B world, the side B community, and where we see division. Often where it's thought to be kind of a monolith. In my circles, I hear people say, "Oh, side B theology." What does that mean? What is there a united side theology?
Hello, everyone. This is TJ. I think we're going to especially revolve around the key question for this episode: what ideas unite and divide the side B community? And from there, we're going to pursue the particular topics or points or conversations that seem to both unite us and sort of divide us, or at least places we're not on a common, not like in rhythm with each other necessarily.
Yeah, in early October, I was just at Revoice, and it's a really sweet time together and also a really just obvious demonstration of the diversity in both some, I guess, maybe expected ways or like really great ways where it's, you have like people coming from around the globe. You have someone from New Zealand. You have actually more than one person from New Zealand, people from South America, et cetera, but also, the different cultures that not only those that are coming from the ethnic communities, but different religious backgrounds, church backgrounds, theological positions, other kind of ways that they might approach certain social issues. There's a lot of diversity. And so it's not just a big old bubble of people who say the same thing. Even within the kind of speakers from the stage, you can hear some, that kind of rubs against what this other speaker said in some certain ways. That I wonder if those two speakers have some differences there. So I often where it's treated as this monolithic community, but in fact, it is a bit divided,
or diverse.
Like,
some divisions, some diverse. It's both. And just for anyone who's listening who may not have heard of Revoice is probably the most prominent U.S. conference for the side B perspective, right? I think it emerged in 2018. Is that right?
Yeah,
David, Frank, and we both attended to the first one and the second one. I think you've attended the subsequent ones, but I've not attended the subsequent ones after. So yeah. Anyways, I think it emerged, in part because there wasn't a lot of common meetings or events for side B people because of the other Christian organizations that were engaging Christians who were queer, LGBT, SSA, whatever. They usually have their side A now, basically, right? So,
which is, Revoice, it makes it such a fun space because there are so few conferences. Like if you want to go to like a theology conference, you can go to one, I assume, from basically like every denominational background. But if you want to come to a community of not straight people talking about sexuality and living out their lives in faithfulness to Jesus, there's not that many in that camp. And there's basically only Revoice that is holding conferences on such large scale where they're also what we call side B, because there are side X, maybe a side Y-ish, like mini conferences around this. Definitely side A events, but is there any side B? So we've talked about kind of side B before, but if we're thinking more kind of line by line, TJ, what things are uniting the side B community in how they're thinking ideologically?
Yeah. So let's talk through these. I've been reflecting on this in preparation for this episode, and these are sort of the ideas that emerged as I was thinking about this, doing some reading, just trying to put the pieces together. In general, as a preface, I would say I see us as sort of a loose coalition, or like we're a loose confederation around a few key ideas. And this sort of interweaves some beliefs, sensibilities, and practices all together in these particular things we're going to talk about.
So should we call it the Confederate communities of the side B world?
Maybe we should, except that sounds bad in U.S. English because of the history of the past of the Civil War in the U.S. But anyways, So obviously, one of the key things that unites us is we are united around what we might call the historic Christian sexual ethic, the traditional biblical sexual ethic, the Catholic Christian sexual ethic, whatever word you might say. But basically the idea that same-sex sex misses the mark of God's intention of design for human beings. It's something to be repented of. And marriage, and thus sex, is meant to be between one man and one woman in a covenant of marriage for their lives, right? That's obviously something that unites us and sets us in opposition, I guess, or in contrast, at least, to side A perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Another key thing that we have focused on a lot is celibate vocation should be honored and upheld in the church. That's an important part of side B, because many side B people are celibate, just as they try to live out sexual faithfulness to God. Not everyone, of course, but many. And I think the other sides are often a little bit more skeptical of celibacy compared to side B. A third point, generally there's more of a willingness to have a more nuanced evaluation of queer sexuality. You can even listen to our recent sort of podcast we had about the gifts of being queer. This is kind of in that line. We're willing to ask questions if there's any goods in being queer. And that's different, especially from side Y and side X. And part of that is there's generally a willingness to also consider queer culture as maybe having good elements, rather than just being a very negative, very anti-Christian, very degenerate, or whatever word you might use, sort of subculture. We're willing to ask the questions. And this is basically contextualization. In my opinion, side B is trying to pursue a contextualized version of the faith in our context related to these topics. So we're willing to ask the questions.
So you're talking about, this general openness to more nuanced evaluation. I was just thinking about how some first-time revoicers, that was one of the things that really stuck out to them, of like, whoa, I was just happy to come to a conference where I could be honest about not being straight. I didn't even think I'd be like at a conference of seeing my sexuality in an alternative light that doesn't just allow me to be honest about the brokenness, but opens up the door to think about, are there some other tangential or connected goods to not being straight, to being gay or something?
Definitely.
So it is something that is definitely present in the side B community, though there are those who maybe haven't spent a lot of time about it and are still hesitant because it feels side A-esque to not focus on the sin part, because they are trying to remain committed to that traditional biblical sexual ethic.
That's true. And this obviously puts us in contrast to side Y and side X schools of thought. But as you said, more similar to side A, like more side A related in this way.
Which is what makes, I think, for a lot of the tension that the side B worlds, because we're in nuance between, like, yes, there are some moral things that we have to, lay down the law on or something. Yeah. But there's more complexity here than just saying, turn it all over and forget about it.
That's right. Kind of, I think a fourth point, side B, and this one has more complexity than the others, but we're typically open to the idea that same-sex sexual orientation is not morally culpable as a sinful action. So just having the same sexual orientation is not morally culpable as sin. Though this one is complex, and you'll hear more about this later.
But not to get too deep in the theological weeds, but Presbyterians would make a big distinction between not morally culpable as a sin versus morally culpable as kind of like capital S sin, which is related to larger theological questions about how does our culpability, our responsibility relate to the fact that we just have this indwelling sin that breaks us, corrupts us, misdirects us, even at a like pre-conscious level. It's just part of our kind of internal waywardness or resistance to God at times. And that is what Presbyterians will often call kind of this biggest sin that indwells us, but different from a sin, a specific sinful action that you commit. So that's why there's typically open to the idea of what TJ said, but definitely nuance in the Presbyterian world, and it's articulated differently than
some other traditions probably are similar, but some other traditions also in the school, they would just focus on the, like, having the temptations would not be sinful, they might say, but falling into lust or actually sinful actions are the things that are worth repenting. Yeah, so we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But fifth one, side B is another major pillar of side B is we say Christians can make prudential judgments or wise judgments about identity terms they might use.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Like SSA, LGBT, queer, whatever. We have no prescriptive way that we say you must talk about this. And this sets us in contrast to typically side Y and side X, especially side Y, who really, like, this is one of the key things they always revolve around, identity terms. So side B does not say it's a prudential judgment, and that's a good way to live a discipleship for Jesus. And then a final thing that unites us, in my opinion, is we're opposed to conversion therapy, quote unquote. And basically the idea that someone does not need to become straight and a person does not need to repent their way into being straight. Yeah. That the goal of the Christian life is holiness and following Jesus more than straightness. And straightness is not necessarily a goal at all. It's not a goal at all. This one has a big complexity because how we define conversion therapy is contested. And especially as more and more communities, for example, in the US, they start to make laws around conversion therapy, quote unquote. There's some complexity in this, but that's generally a thing that unites us, and that's in opposition to side X. That puts us in contrast to side X perspectives. So yeah, I think we both agree those are key pillars. And well, we have these common principles, pillars that unite us. There's also many things that we're not united around. And again, these are both differences and actually divisions. I want to share a brief story about this. So we have a mutual friend. He's actually a member of David Frank's church. And we were at a Preston Sprinkle conference together, who's like a straight ally of the Side B community. And he does conferences on sexuality and gender, other things, but those two. We were at a conference together and we were talking about the trans experience because part of the conversation was about the trans experience and gender. And he asked me, like, oh, what does Side B think about trans experience? Like, what's happening there? And I said, well, we think a lot of different things. You know, there's not a unity around this topic necessarily. And he was like, why not? Don't you guys want to have a united position on this? And after thinking about that, I was thinking, well, there's so many differences that we don't have. There's so many differences that would not make us be united on some topics like this, right? And I think it's helpful to realize that we can still be united, but also have these differences or divisions. So his story kind of put in me this way of, well, I guess we're being perceived as a very, very coherent, cohesive school of thought. And while we are a school of thought, we're not necessarily that. We're not a school of thought that has a united like statement of faith on all points or something, whatever you might see united as being. We're not that. So, okay, but we are united. But we'll say more about that in a second. But these are some kind of key differences that I've thought about that we have among us overall. First, a lot of our key differences actually emerge from different traditions. As a few minutes ago, you heard David Frank talking about a certain way that Presbyterians consider sin and same-sex sexuality as an orientation that might be sinful. This obviously emerges from different theological beliefs, sensibilities, and practices that are prior to our Side B beliefs and opinions, or integrated with them or something. But our different traditions really shape how we think about this. There's the Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, the Free Church people, Wesleyans, Orthodox, Lutherans. We have many different traditions, and that shapes how we engage these questions quite a bit.
And let me say, the Presbyterians brought the heat at Revoice. They had,
I think that's true,
Greg Johnson and Misty Irons back to back, and it was intense. It was so great.
I definitely admired their contributions to the Revoice. I watched them later online. Yeah, I admired their work a lot. Their sharing was great. Another different example of this, some traditions would still maintain celibacy as a vocation or call. That's kind of a common part of the church, like Catholics or Orthodox. They engage these conversations differently than most Protestants who got rid of all celibate vocations, like over time. So, I mean, there's just
I
these
think
differences are pretty
that's been
important.
one of the things that
So,
the side B world has forced itself to, well, a lot of the side B world, has been like Protestant, but then where they find this unity with side B Catholics, not just the unity of like, oh yeah, we agree on all those things, but we actually kind of rely upon the Catholic tradition to see this history of honored celibate vocations that just
100%.
doesn't really exist in the Protestant tradition. There are some notable figures, John Stott, who did live celibate lives, but culturally and even theologically, it's not something that's really been focused on. So, yeah, in these different different theological backgrounds, it's cool to see the cross-pollinating that happens.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with you. Another big difference is we all come from different backgrounds or contexts, right? Like there's US people, UK people, Australian people, people from various African countries, South American countries, like Brazil, Kenya, South Africa, Singapore. Like there's people from all over who are kind of together with us. And they're broadly side B school of thought, but still our context leads to different beliefs, sensibilities, practices around these topics. For example, one thing I can say in like African contexts that I know and am part of, we don't say gay. And like we don't, like, you know what I mean? Our language politics are more close to side Y in the sense we won't say gay, but we're side B because we don't mandate you must say same-sex attracted or whatever. So now we're side B, but we would not use the terms for ourselves. But in the UK or the US, whatever, there's a lot more openness to these terms, Like, I don't know, I think there's emerging data that in the US, like 15 to 20% of people, youth, are willing to use some of these terms about themselves, like LGBT or whatever, or queer. And that's not the same in other parts of the world, for example. So that's a pretty big difference, which shapes how we engage some of these questions.
Which really connects to just this general, like, how do we relate to queer culture, which is primarily a Western creation?
Yeah, definitely. I would say 100%. I mean, it's emerging in other parts of the world through globalization, and as certain international political actors start pressuring countries to adopt certain policies, it's emerged.
Yeah, I was just at a Steiger Ministries event, and Steiger Ministries, I think, actually focuses on the global youth culture. And they showed this picture of these, I don't know, late teens, maybe 20-somethings in a coffee shop. They made the photo black and white, and they're just like, what country do you think this is in? And we had guesses, like South America, and I think it might have ended up being Singapore. Was it Singapore or was it somewhere in the Middle East? Anyways, it was just like, you could not tell based off of how their haircuts, their stylization, the clothes they were wearing, where they were, because there's this global youth culture that is just throughout the entire world through media, which is just kind of nuts. Anyways, that's just is fascinating to think about, these cultures that used to be so very different. Now youth are participating through their phones in like one mega culture.
Dominated by the US. Like if you go to a lot of African communities, they try to dress as US people, like US youth, And yeah, so I mean, just saying yes, 100%. And that's another key difference among ourselves. You just mentioned relationship to queer culture, queer subcultures probably. But this is one of the key differences, I think, that a lot of maybe even divisions in the side B community generally, we have a lot of different perspectives on how to relate to queer culture and how to engage like LGBT representation in media. A brief story. I like a series called Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. And this is a bit of a spoiler, so if you watch these shows, don't listen. But basically, at the end of Legend of Korra, the main protagonist, Korra, she starts a relationship with another woman. And I won't say the name just in case you don't want horrible spoilers. But I didn't know how I felt about that as a side B person when I first watched it a couple years ago. And yeah, and I'll just lay it out there. I lean more skeptical on relating to queer subcultures in the US, even though I still think it's a good, like 100%. Like I think there can be goods in it, but I just lean more skeptical. And like, I think there may be goods, but I think there's a lot of potential problems at the same time. And you'll never hear me dismiss cultural engagement by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah,
But
like you still
I think there's complexities. So
would do you have a recommendation of what your favorite, like, quote unquote queer film is?
yeah, actually, but it's my favorite film of all time. So I'm just saying it's called Moonlight. It's LGBT related, and it's also my favorite film at the same time. So I'm trying to tell you, I'm in this tension, but I think a lot of us, many people in the cyber community they have differences or different perspectives or tension in how to relate to queer culture. And part of that is because I had not been around a lot of the US queer subculture in my life, right? Like we had a podcast ago where I went to my first, what was it called? LGBT festival in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Queer Pride Parade. So, I mean, it just hasn't been my life. But, yeah.
As we think about some of these, I mean, obviously there's just like the global diversity, cultural diversity, but as we get into like the differences in how people feel about engaging in queer culture, this is so much tied up to not just like, cultural or theological background, but very experiential for people in the side B world. If even like side B, while one thing we're united about is we're united about not being separated off of language, but we very clearly, and I don't know if it ever needs to be more clear, do not want to push that upon people, and are very okay with people saying, that triggers stuff that I've tried to leave behind. If someone was in lesbian relationships and they stopped calling themselves lesbian after they left those lesbian sexual relationships, the side B is not like, oh no, you're denying something or other.
Yeah, I would be like, okay.
They're like, yeah, like, you fine. Describe yourself as same-sex, sexually attracted, whatever you want.
It's fine.
That's fine. And so even people's relation to queer culture, queer film and media can often be less about, I think that's like a sinful action, as much as like, where I'm at, that's not helping me deepen my roots in Christian faithfulness and knowing God and making that a central part of my life. And it's too easily, a distraction. Video games, honestly, are like that for me, of like, I can't and this isn't about identification, but just participation in like video game culture. I kind of just have to keep it at an arm's distance so that I just don't get sucked into being addicted to video games, because I'm just prone to video game addiction. And I think it's not like I think Super Smash Brothers is a really phenomenal game, but I actually just need to keep it a little bit distant from me. I was just telling my roommate. And I think that's similar in some of these differences in side B community, that depending on people's backgrounds or just where they're at in relating to the queer community, you'll see different postures.
Yeah,
and
most definitely.
They'll inform their ministry in some ways or just inform their life.
Yeah, true. So true. Another key difference that I think exists in our community is how we theologically evaluate side A beliefs and also side Y beliefs, and maybe X to some extent. But you'll find in the side B community that we're not united on how necessarily they think. If we're side B, we probably think side A has something wrong and side Y has something wrong about them. But you're not united on the extent of that, what that always is. Okay, side A maybe, but the extent of it sometimes. Or what it means for their Christian life.
Can we take like 5 or 10 minutes on this, TJ? Because
sure.
I want to ask not just like, what are the differences, but like, okay, largely we have different postures on side A, or like how serious we think the side A beliefs are. But like, why is that? Where is this coming from? Do we have time to answer?
Yeah.
Like,
where does our differences in how we theologically evaluate side A and side Y come from?
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking about? I have some thoughts. At least one is where we come from originally, Some of us come from communities where side A is the most prominent perspective.
Okay.
Or we were side A previously. Some of us come from positions where side Y was the most prominent perspective. We were side Y originally. I'm the latter. I was more side Y as a young Christian, I guess. I didn't have the terms, but I was more like that.
So what did that mean? Like, coming from side Y, does that make you more antagonistic to side Y, or that's actually why you're more hesitant, or like what does that mean? That's your background. So how does that inform your evaluation?
I'm not very sympathetic to side Y, but coming from a side Y perspective, maybe even more unsympathetic to side A than I would have been otherwise, I think. That's how I see it.
So that's made you less sympathetic to side A than you think you might have been otherwise, because you were already kind of grew up in a context where that was more or less a condemned position.
Yeah, basically. I'm not, these are, well, I've talked about this in other podcasts, why I'm side B and not the other sides. So there's that. But I think part of it is the theological differences that we hold that are also raised on sensibilities. And in some ways, I've been informed in my life, a lot of my sensibilities have been formed by sensibilities towards truth as a high good. There's other higher goods, in my opinion. But wanting to hold the truth of the faith passed on to the saints has been like an important part of my Christian discipleship. Sometimes too much, but like too high of a good that overshadowed other goods. And it's not my main orientation as like the goods I'm most oriented towards, but it's just been like that. So when I think of side A, I think of side A as notably not following certain revealed ways of living faithfully, or ways that they should be following that should be not difficult to understand.
And the worship of truthfulness kind of coming from side Y backgrounds, which are often, I would say, more common in, well, I don't know, there's probably Catholic and Orthodox versions of this as well. But I definitely see that in a lot of evangelicalism or fundamentalism that really focuses on what's true.
Yeah.
So like, you've toned down this like need for certainty on what's true.
Definitely.
But how much has that tuned down your other things that you've probably like, oh, I used to think this was really important, but that was just because I thought we needed certainty and, absolutely aligned doctrinal statements on everything. But with that gone, why do you still have a strong, or is that something that you've already answered in a podcast?
I might have answered it, but I still have a side B belief, position, sensibility, because I think it's the most faithful and best account of all we know about what God has taught his church and how we see human beings existing in the world.
And so what do you think is the position of those who are still side B, but are kind of side A friendly? They're like, if you decide to be side A, I'll love and support you in that. I just don't think it's the best. It's maybe more similar to how certain churches, well, I won't try to give a comparison, but I would say that there's a spectrum in side B of those who are like, whoa, like don't be side A.
Yeah.
Like that's really dangerous. Versus others who will say, that's the most important thing is for you to find kind of authenticity and integrity. And we think that should be in side B, but if you need to find, I don't know, is that the narration of those who are kind of open to side A?
I think you narrated well the broad differences on the spectrum. I've shifted a bit over time, but I'm closer to the former, closer to like there's spiritual danger here based on what we know from the scriptures and the tradition and how we see human beings exist in the world. Don't walk this path. But at the same time, I have side A friends. I still want to be their friend. I mean, I'm kind of in the middle in that way. But yeah, in my side B life, my side B sensibilities, I think the churches should teach others to walk in faithfulness to God and avoid ways of life which lead you away from faithfulness to the living God. And that includes lots of things: economic, political, social, but it also includes sexual. And that's what we're talking about right now. So yeah, that's why I process it.
Yeah, I think I am similarly positioned to you in that kind of spectrum of how big a deal is, or how big of a gap is there between side A and side B. And something that I've articulated of sin is dangerous, where there are other theological or church practice differences about who should be doing what do we have
Mm-hmm.
priests, do we not have priests. A lot of those differences don't have issues on what is sin.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe just that like the gospel has led us into forgiveness, so we don't have to be like always worried of like, oh no, am I sinning right now? Because like there's forgiveness readily available. And we are meant to be clothed in the righteousness of Christ, very actively clothed, and that sin continues to be a threat to blinding us, to darkening us, to diminishing the like Christ church being in this world what we want it to be. And I think everybody, you will find some topic and they will agree, oh yeah, like abuse scandals in the church, right? We're not just like, well, there's sin in the church and it's not a big deal. We're like, no, for the church, the place where you're supposed to find like your way home to God and your spiritual family, for that to be in a place of abuse, that is so wicked.
Yeah.
And so like actual sin born out in the people of God, like it has real, as TJ said, spiritual danger. And there are, in a sense, bigger sins and smaller sins, not in regards to whether Christ can forgive them, but in regards to like their effects. And we can both look at that practically, I believe, but we can also go to scripture and to use spiritual danger, because I think in scripture it gives specific warnings towards certain sins in different ways. And the sin of same-sex sex, not same-sex dating or holding hands or something like that. Like we're like, nope, Bible doesn't condemn that, but it gives really strong warnings that's what leads me in my evaluation to taking those things seriously. And as uncomfortable as it is to have a kind of a strong stance on it, I do it because I believe there's real spiritual harm.
Yeah, I'm the same. But you will find, if you listen to some of our past episodes where we engage side A voices, you will see we both, I think, have many similarities to side A people in some of our theological ideas or sensibilities. But we notably differ on this one. And part of that, I think, for me is, I assume the Christian life of discipleship. I think Christians should be united in the truth. But many Christians are not able to explicate all that the church has taught over time, right? But even if you can't explicate or I can't explicate, I'm still called to a life of holiness. And the fruits of the Spirit are like kind of the goods that I need to exemplify in my life, right? So even if I can't understand why same-sex marriage can't articulate ins and outs and everything, the call towards holiness and away from sexual immorality is still on me. And I still interpret that the faith that has been taught to us is that same-sex sex is off the table or misses the mark. So even if you can't understand all the in-depth conversations, we still need to live a holy life as much as we can. And of course, there's repentance if you fall, and people can turn around and walk in a new way of life, and that's holy and great. But I think that's how it is. And I think part of the difference, as you mentioned, is I think it's dire enough where the stakes are high enough that I'm skeptical towards some of the side B perspectives that are just saying, well, at least you're being at least you're trying to follow Jesus and you're being authentic, and that's fine. I think that's true and that's good. And I'm not saying I'm not judging who's gonna suffer God's wrath. Like, that's not my role to judge in and out. I'm not a bishop. I'm not a priest. But I'll say what I think, what I understand the scripture is teaching, what the church has been teaching. So,
and I think that's a huge part, is that Jesus says, kind of like more or less, like, don't judge. But he actually says, lest that same measure be brought back to you. And even more so, you just alluded to this. Oh, but does the church have the keys of the kingdom? Does the church actually have a need to discipline appropriately?
Yeah.
And so folks who aren't like, both, I'm not in an ecclesial position to like be discipling them. So until they've been like excommunicated in some type of way, I can't like regard them not as my brother or sister, even if I really believe that they are wrong on this. And Oh, so I want to get back to what you were saying of you do not condemn them, even if you believe that their actions are something that God says like that is condemnable and might make you liable for like condemnation from God. So you will give them warnings, say, hey, I think this is sin that you actually need to leave if they're engaging in sin. But that's very different from us holding ourselves judgmentally.
Yeah.
And so I feel like a lot of this is not just in this conversation, but a lot of our Christian culture, we so want to leave behind the legalism and judgmentalism that maybe we've seen in the church or in our, like faith forebears. We're like, oh, they're just so judgmental. And so I need to stop being judgmental. But I feel like you can hold that together. You can stop being judgmental while also being, without changing what you think is like really important in life.
Yeah.
In fact, I think
too.
Rosaria Butterfield, someone who critiques side B a lot, actually practices this dynamic well with regards to people who are explicitly in same-sex relationships. She actually probably makes a bigger deal about side B people and the way that she thinks we're confusing things and doing like false teaching or something. But if she had, like her lesbian neighbors who are in a lesbian relationship and have children, she would invite them over to their dinner table. She doesn't think a sexual orientation framework is good. She doesn't think that those labels are helpful, and she wants them to know Jesus. And then if they came to know Jesus and were like side A, she would still be like bringing them over to the table and saying, I love you, I care for you, and I think this is dangerous. So I don't know if I'm speaking clearly.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think that's what you said is admirable. I'm probably more skeptical of Rosaria Butterfield than you may be, but I think what you said is admirable.
Yeah, in terms of just this type of posture of being able to, we don't have to skimp out on difficult ethical claims in order to be friendly and loving.
I don't
and
think so at all.
caring. Though, okay,
No.
like in side B kind of community conversations, I think we have seen people who are so stuck on trying to figure out what is true on this topic of side A, side B, that it does lead to like a spiritual spiral, and
But
that distracts them from, in a sense, trusting Jesus.
I think there's something true about that. But I also say I think the stakes are high in the conversation too. Like where you end up, I think the stakes are high because it really impacts your life. So I'm not sure. Yeah, you might be right though.
Well, yeah, and so it's just like if someone is spiraling and like, oh, what should I do? Side A, side B. I think someone would say, I think appropriately, that question should be downplayed or not downplayed, but basically like, should I pursue a same-sex sexual relationship or not? That should never be the first question in our faith. The question is like, is Jesus Lord?
Yeah.
And do I trust him? Does he love me? Does his sacrifice like apply to me? And maybe growing up Christian, it's really easy to check box those answers because we know we're supposed to say yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I've seen people who are what we might say at times like more side A friendly compared to us or something. They're trying to get people to just return to the more important faith questions.
Yeah.
And so they downplay that. But
well, part of this is how we theologically evaluate the sexual ethics of the church in relation to the core, like the coreness of the faith. You know what I mean? I think you and I might think they're closer, but sometimes when I talk to others who are side B friendly, but maybe not side B exactly, they put them farther away from like the core. Does that make sense? Like, yeah.
They think that question around is same-sex sex, moral or not moral, that's like, oh, it's like a tertiary or fourth order degree question. And I think we'd say like that issues on this question, particularly as it relates to actual like sinful action, is a like second order issue. You know, first order
Yeah, I would
Trinitarian,
too. Yeah.
second order highly important is around this. And
I would say that, yes, in the tier system, I would say it's like second order.
And that
And
if we just to flip of where do we see a spectrum of kind of theological evaluation positionality with how people think about side Y beliefs for a side B community, that we see a lot of side B people who are like, I'm side BY. Those are the folks who are more disconnected from queer culture. I don't know how much I really want to associate with gay queer language, and so I'm very they're kind of side BY. They're in that range and they lean that way. And others who I would say are more, well, this would be my guess. So those are people probably like us who come from more of like side Y backgrounds. And so then they kind of are like inching their way into the side B world. They're like, oh, I guess we can talk about this more. Versus others who have experienced maybe trauma, abuse as a queer person. They associate the kind of side Y-ness or definitely side X positions as this kind of neglect, at the very least, neglect of the queer community. And so folks who we might say are more like side AB, they're still like, oh, I think side B's right. I would agree with all those things TJ said of what unites us as side B. But the real enemy isn't our side A people who are affirming the rights and dignity of queer people. But the enemy are people like side Y and anyone who does not support queer people.
Correct. You're correct. Yes. I think everything you said is right. And when you describe that, I find myself, I don't know where I fit exactly, but I find myself pretty in the middle of side B. Like, I'm pretty skeptical of side Y people, but I'm definitely not side A as of now. And I don't know if I'm going to shift ever. It's not my plan to shift. So yeah.
Yeah. It's like what, kind of going back to the Jonathan Haidt episode, what are these different moral evaluations and claims that strike people most heavily? Is it this purity to the faith? Is it a sense of just active harm and injustice in this world? Is it a alignment with really seeing the spiritual harms that comes with, following God's word or not following it? There's these different moral poles that, we asked, what are the ideas that unite and divide the side B community? But a lot of this is, it's coming from people's backgrounds and their guts more than their minds.
Yeah, you're right. Their guts, 100%.
It's like, in my gut, I know I have to defend this.
Yep. Kudos to you for bringing the moral psychology, because that's totally true. That's like the sensibilities. Like if you were raised, like if your sensibility of purity is so high, you probably engage with this in a different way than if, as you said, the justice sort of fairness, harm, whatever is higher. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really, especially like on online, chatting or to get at these like deeply held gut reactions. And it included that I'd say like this global youth culture has a gut reaction against condemnation. Like I'm almost like, should I have not even mentioned that word? Someone might have already turned off this episode because I even said condemnation of sin. And that just triggered them into being like, these guys, TJ and David, are those types of people. They condemn. And it's like, oh gosh, I hope I'm not seen as that type of person. That, it's like there's this huge aversion to associating with anything that's associated with condemnation, with, judging other people. And that's I think the strength of being a side B in this current cultural climate is being able to say, hey, I have a traditional sexual ethic and I'm gay. And like, wait, does it mean you hate yourself or is there something else going on here? Because I've been told to associate that stance with judgment and condemnation and hatred, but of the people that you just associated with. And so it forces people to like start to nuance that gut reaction.
So much.
And it's like one of the main reasons I just continue to use queer identifying language is to challenge that gut reaction that sometimes oversimplifies itself. Not saying gut reactions are bad, like they can hit on some really important truths and help us stand behind them. But sometimes they're not nuanced.
Agreed, 100%. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there.
So TJ, we don't have that much more time. What are a few more things that there's just some diversity or differences in how ideology in the side B world?
Yeah. Another one, these are kind of together, but one is, first one I'll mention is gender norms. We disagree to what extent gender norms are valuable. And I'm going to ask you to mention this briefly, but this also relates to the transgender experience. Maybe David Frank, you'll say something more about this in particular.
Yeah, I think that it's really been interesting, specifically the revoice being a part of the side B world, is just seeing the ways that you have a lot of gay people who are entering into this side B conversation and are just like, oh great, we can talk about sexuality. And then as revoice starts bringing up this gender component as well around trans experiences, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. These are just radically different. And it's not, I mean, they're connected. Sex and gender are obviously very integrated parts of our experience, but it's not something that a gay man who just has been struggling with same-sex sexual attraction has had to think about. There's no automatic connection to the trans experience aside from maybe saying, oh, I guess I know what it's like to be dismissed and my experience not to be welcome to be talked about. So it hopefully makes us more open to just listening to people to understand what people mean when they say trans. Yeah. And I think that's been there's not agreement on how people feel about pronouns or how to talk about it, but it's been educational for me to even learn that in a similar way that when people say they're gay and it is just talking about their sexual orientation, for some trans people, it can just be talking about gender dysphoria. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they've sought to resolve that, with or without therapy, with or without, changing of appearances, etc. And so it's a complex topic that there's definitely, I think, a lot of still just learning and engaging in the side B community. Some who've already come to maybe certain conclusions and are wanting to advocate for those, but a lot of people who it's still just very new to.
Yeah, so true. So true. Kind of related to that, another kind of division even of the side B community is we don't have a common idea on how the Christian influence should be on the common life as a polity in our contexts. For example, some of us think that the Christian marriage ethic should be the ethic of a society, right? It should be instantiated in law or policy as this is how society should be. Others kind of prefer the liberal democratic contemporary secular model where the regime of marriage is many things.
So a side B person who fits that former side of it would say, oh, I'm side B, but I still want enforced straight marriages and even potentially laws against, same-sex sexual behavior, depending on how strong their Christian.
That makes me nervous, but yeah, that makes me nervous. But you see the difference, though. Some people think that the Christian sexual ethic is the best human sexual ethic, and that's the right way, and society should recognize that. Insofar as Jesus is the King of Kings and Lords of Lords, the lords and kings of the earth should recognize his way. Otherwise they're very distant. They're almost diabolical. They're not walking in God's way at all. Others, again, are just it's different. There's differences in key theopolitical sensibilities and ideas that how Christianity should relate.
Others who will very much more actively even promote gay marriage existing in society, even though that they are side B and don't gay marriages in the church or for themselves. But they see it as part of a political, either just freedom and a movement away from Christian reign of terror or something.
Yeah, something like that. And this even touches the trans. There's questions on how the trans experience should fit into social life or public life. And there's differences on that as well. But this is just another key difference. We don't usually engage it much in conversation, but it underlies a lot of I think it underlies some of our different topics or conversations we talk about.
Most side B conversations are kind of our often people are more in the neutral. There's probably not a whole lot of people spending time arguing for this like strong, Christian imposition of the moral order. But there are definitely differences there.
There definitely are. I have lots of thoughts on that, but we're going to move on. Next, we don't necessarily agree on celibate partnerships as a type of relationship, because, like, for me, I'm very pro that I'm existing. And that in some ways puts me closer to one wing of the side B. But there's others who are very nervous about them as occasions for sin, basically.
This is something I hope we can get more clarity on as a community, because there are certain ways that people articulate a celibate partnership that I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem like it has a lot of good roots or doesn't have much integrity or foundation. And other ways that I'm like, how could people even be suspicious of this?
Sure.
Which I won't get into now, but I do hope we can get, a lot of it is just clarity on intent, clarity on meaning. And I would think that a celibate partnership that's more so under the umbrella of covenant brotherhood should be really healthily engaged. Though,
100%.
I do still have questions about what is the goal of celibacy and how does that just tie in with like commitments and vows. But anyways, there's just lots of questions of like monastic orders and how they handle celibacy and partnerships.
And don't worry, David Frank, and also listeners will engage this question more.
So many good questions about it, but I do hope we can get to some increasing unity on things around celibate partnerships.
I'll also say, I'm just gonna
wrap us up.
I'll wrap this up. We also just have the general differences that happen in communities, like the difference in racial politics or sometimes social solidarity, how we handle representation of one another, other things, just those general human things. So that's kind of a key point. And basically, so in some sense, we are united on our key things, but we are not a monolith. And this is similar to most human groups who have common objects of love or common agreement on certain things. They may have these things, but they're not a monolith. And in some sense, you could say we have different wings of our broad school of thought. So anyways, we had a discussion on what unites us and what divides us. Now we could ask, why does recognizing this matter?
Yeah.
Well, for anyone who is listening, I think it helps you perceive the reality of things and recognize the complexity of our school of thought, our movement, our community. That in some ways we're united and divided. It also, second point, I think it helps you recognize that side B, we're like a focused, a minimalist school of thought. Like we're not a maximalist. We don't agree on everything or don't try to mandate a very large set of many things everyone must agree on. But we have a core agreement, like a coalition on a few things. And we don't have a singular full position on every topic or point we may want to talk about, even if we have a core unity in general.
I'm just thinking about that, like, it's almost lowest common denominator and just like, what are our key issues? Let's unite around those. And that's why I want to like win side Y people into side B of like, hey, you don't have to agree with some other side B people on how they engage queer culture, but can you at least just give yourself to some openness around how people use this language and thus, come into the side B umbrella and be kind of that side BY person. And even side X people who are like really love healing. So this is like neo side X that I think exists, that of like, hey, just give up on trying to make people straight and come underneath the side B umbrella. There's a lot of room for you to be, there's a lot of room under the side B umbrella. And I want people to come together and basically under like Christian truthfulness and faithfulness so that we can be having productive conversations and work together rather than having to continue to waste time on these, like, as a side B person, these blockades or barriers that sometimes get more focused than are needed.
Just to point to add to that, I want like side Y and side X to recognize that theology is contextual and the Christian life is contextual, meaning we're being faithful in particular contexts. We're supposed to be rooted in certain contexts. And that allows our faithfulness to actually be faithful to God, first of all, but second, connect with other people in our communities that we're supposed to be working with or working among. So there's also that kind of a final point. Like I said, we are a notable school of thought that's broadly united on key points. We share core beliefs, core sensibilities, and I think that allows us to talk about side B theology or theologies that emerge from our work, because we do have enough unity to do so. And I think that's an important realization, to realize that we are united enough to produce our own ways of thinking, our own theologies, as we try to be faithful to God, basically. In my opinion, all communities, all subcommunities, subcultures, whatever you might say, it's good if they produce their own theologies, because their experiences, their ways of thinking, their cultural values are often not reflected in dominant theological frameworks, right? So they add to the church by opening the conversation, seeing where God is faithful in ways the dominant church often doesn't recognize or doesn't know about. So I think our unity also allows us to add something, because we are from a different perspective. We add something to the whole church in faithfulness. We bring the gifts that we have to God in faithfulness. And I think that's a key thing that's good about us and what we're trying to do in the contemporary church, in the contemporary world, around a very difficult topic that is impacting the whole world, about the Christian faith and sex and human anthropology, theological anthropology, human anthropology. So we're at an edge of important conversation for the church. And I wish more people would recognize it, but I mean, their own evaluation of us changes how they think about this. But we're doing something that I think is helpful for the whole church.
So let me try this out on you. Side B theology is united enough to encourage the church in Christian faithfulness, but diverse enough to be having lovingly constructive, critical conversations within the community.
Love it. Thank you, David Frank. It's so good. All those things are true. Yeah. I think we should wrap up after that great statement.
Okay, well, we'll end there. Thanks, listeners, if you've joined us this far, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Feel free to support us on Patreon if you want to both support these conversations happening, as well as engage in kind of more feedback into where this podcast should go. But for any listeners, we welcome any feedback, any questions. Don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yeah, and we launched an Instagram page recently, so if you're on Instagram, please consider following us.
There's some fun little pictures and videos. I'm easily amazed by what Elena is doing on there. So check it out.
Our podcast manager is great. Check it out. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye. Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.